You have 5 types of capital that are available to each person. Include intellectual capital, social capital, cultural capital, and personal capital, in addition to financial capital. And in my opinion, personal capital is the most important type of capital. It is the ultimate type of capital that you want to strive for. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Good Problems to Have with David Nima. I'm your host, happiness coach, and author of the book, Good Problems to Have, The Anatomy of Contemporary Happiness. And in today's episode, I'm going to discuss chapter 4 of the book, which is the topic of wealth. And the reason I want to discuss wealth is because I think people have a misconception about what is true wealth and how to create wealth. One of the basic premise of wealth of this chapter is that most people equate wealth with financial capital. They equate wealth with the number of assets and possessions that they have. Even in the definition, in the dictionary, if you search the word wealth, you will see essentially a money-related definition, such as an abundance of valuable possessions or money. But this completely misses the point of what is true wealth and potentially how to create wealth for yourself in your life. The basis of this chapter and this discussion is from a course that I took at UCLA during my undergrad called Intellectual History. Or in that course, we learned about 4 types of capital, and I've added a 5th type myself to this chapter. The types of capital that essentially exist are, of course, financial capital, which most people are familiar with. And this is kind of the number of financial resources or the amount of financial resources that a person has. But that's not the only type of capital that you are potentially privy to. Other types of capital include intellectual capital, social capital, cultural capital, and personal capital, in addition to financial capital. So you have 5 types of capital that are available to each person. So let's talk about that a little bit in more detail. And what are these different types of capital? So essentially, intellectual capital is what you know. And the more you know, the more capable you are, the more wealthy I would say you are. I mean, frankly, if you have an abundance of information, you can become financially wealthy relatively easily by using your wisdom, using your intellectual capital to generate wealth. So intellectual capital, or what you know, is a form of wealth. And I would want to, I assess my own personal wealth based on my intellectual capital in addition to other forms of capital. The next form of capital that I think is important to think about is social capital. Social capital is essentially who you know, okay? Whether it's family members, neighbors, co-workers, maybe your follower base or your followers on social media, but who you know is a form of capital, and it can affect your overall wealth. Next is cultural capital. Cultural capital is essentially how well you know your environment and how well you're able to potentially adapt to your environment, but certainly be aware of your environment. Of course, we all know that we can potentially be in very different environments at different times. For example, if you're traveling to a new city and you're not familiar with the streets and the neighborhoods, knowing these things can be very kind of potentially life-saving, or if nothing else, can help you have a better vacation to that city. So therefore, cultural capital and being aware of your surroundings and being kind of respectful of your environment is certainly a type of capital that you want to be aware of. Now, of course, it can also mean that you're a quote-unquote cultured person, but I think more broadly, it really applies to your ability to read the room, and your ability to essentially adapt to the room, whether that's in the outdoors or in a boardroom or in the city or any other kind of environment that you might find yourself in. Cultural capital. Next is financial capital. And of course, we're all familiar with financial capital. This is the type of capital that most people kind of strive for, kind of to the neglecting those other types of capital, such as intellectual capital, social capital, and cultural capital, as well as personal capital. So financial capital is the most common, well-known type of capital, and certainly a good resource to have in your arsenal. So yes, the financial capital can contribute to wealth. And next is personal capital. Personal capital is essentially your own health and well-being, and how well you know yourself, and how much you love yourself and you accept yourself. So we talk about self-awareness, self-acceptance, and self-love in chapter 2. It's certainly a critical component of happiness and love. And here under the chapter of wealth, it pops up again in the form of personal capital. In fact, most people strive to have other types of capital, such as intellectual capital or financial capital, because they ultimately want personal capital. They want to be confident with themselves, and they want to be able to like themselves or feel accepted and love themselves. Personal capital. And as I discussed in chapter 2, the path to self-love, the formula for self-love, you don't have to wait for any other type of capital to have personal capital right away, to have self-love right away. And in my opinion, personal capital is the most important type of capital. It is the ultimate type of capital that you want to strive for. And if you can leverage other types of capital to have more of an abundance of personal capital, and to love yourself more, and to know yourself more, and accept yourself more, you are by far the wealthiest person, in the room, so to speak. Versus other people that may have a lot of intellectual capital, social capital, financial capital, or even cultural capital. Ultimately, at the end of the day, personal capital is where it's at. And again, personal capital has to do with your health and well-being, and how well you know yourself and accept yourself, and how much you love yourself. Now, as I discuss further in the book, these types of capital can kind of work with each other and help you generate more capital and ultimately be more wealthy. If you have a lot of intellectual capital, as I discussed, you can use that to make a lot of financial capital. Or you can use your intellectual capital, what you know, to make friends. So you can increase your social capital. Ultimately, and if you have a lot of financial capital, you can go and buy, you can buy friends, certainly. You can, go to clubs and meetings and whatnot and buy and, essentially meet new friends because of your financial capital. You can use your financial capital to gain more intellectual capital. You can use your financial capital to become have more cultural capital. So these types of capital certainly work well with each other. Social capital is another form of capital that is highly leverageable. You can leverage your social capital to basically get a job and make money. So that's financial capital. You can also use your social capital to have friends or family tell you stuff or teach you things. That is a form of intellectual capital that comes through the source of your social capital. And ultimately, personal capital really opens the door to a lot of other types of capital as well, because the more you know yourself and the more you love yourself, you're generally more your mind is more stimulated, and you're capable of taking on more intellectual capital. You become a more social and happy person, and you're going to make more friends, improving your social capital. You're going to probably be better in business and just generally a more confident person. And those things typically are correlated with more financial capital. So personal capital is highly leverageable. And again, personal capital is where it's at. So that's it. Those are the different types of capital and what I consider wealth. That is the prism through which I analyze wealth, my own personal wealth especially. And I'm always kind of analyzing myself and thinking to myself that, I have an abundance of intellectual capital. I have an abundance of social capital. I have an abundance of cultural capital. I have an abundance of financial capital. And I have an abundance of personal capital. And I am wealthy. Certainly one of the affirmations that I use. But I mean it in terms of these different types of capital, not just the money in the bank account. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to GPH Lifestyle on Instagram and YouTube. Share this video with your friends that have misconceptions about wealth and personal capital. And I'll see you guys at the next episode. I'm David Nima, host of Good Problems to Have, The Anatomy of Contemporary Happiness. You can pick up a copy of Good Problems to Have on Amazon, and I will see you on the next video.